Robert Marshall. I was president of the Lutheran Church in America.
Why a new Lutheran church?
Well, I think there had been a growing sentiment that there should be church unity among Lutherans. That had been the basic viewpoint of the Lutheran Church in America and of the United Lutheran Church before it. But as time had gone on, the old battles over theological differences had waned, and so the growing feeling that there should be Lutheran unity.
This view was held by the Lutheran Church in America, but not necessarily by the American Lutheran Church.
It had grown in the American Lutheran Church to the point where their district conventions were taking action, calling for the Commission for Lutheran Unity.
Talk about your counterpart in the American Lutheran Church during the days when you were prior to the CNLC and the talks that you had personally.
Yes. When I started as president of the Lutheran Church in America, Dr. Schutz was still president of the American Lutheran Church. I think his conviction that the ALC was not quite ready to discuss Lutheran unity and to move forward on it. I think David Preuss, too, had reservations about it. But the action of the district conventions changed his mind so that he went along with it.
There was an ALC leader between Schutz and Preuss.
Oh yes, Kent Knudsen.
Talk about him.
Well, Kent was probably my closest friend among church presidents, and he and I, in fact, were talking about approaching Lutheran unity in a different way than evolved. We were talking about uniting departments and offices of the churches where there was a will on both sides to do that. He had been confronted with this by their Department of Foreign Missions or Global Missions. I'm not sure of their terminology. They had actually voted to combine with the LCA, Board of Global Mission. And Dr. Schatz made the board reconsider that. But when Kent came in, he was favorable to it and began talking about what other parts of the churches might be ready. He thought of the boards of publication, for example, but those boards were not ready. But that's the pattern that Kent and I were working on. Dr. Knudsen actually had sat with me at a meeting of the Lutheran World Federation to go over how our church was reorganizing at the time, and went back and reorganized the ALC as closely as possible to the LCA organization so that we could gradually mesh the two church bodies. But of course, Dr. Knudsen died, and that made a different approach necessary.
Talk about describe for me the social and political climate of the day outside of the church. What was the tremendously tumultuous time?
Well, we're talking about the 1980s, and I'm not sure I would describe that as the most tumultuous of times.
Actually, I was referring to the years prior, like in the early 70s when these talks first sort of began to emerge.
Well, the 80s, of course, were the Reagan years when the United States was pretty well peaceful. But if one goes back to the 1960s, you have the tumult in American society and the difficulties about the Vietnamese War, where the protesters proved to be right, that the U.S. was not on a path that could lead to the victory and overcoming the domino theory that was part of the rationale for the war. So then we went into the 70s, and the Vietnam War continued under President Nixon, who finally had to make the decision to withdraw. The Nixon administration went afoul on the Watergate scandal and so forth. So those were far more tumultuous years. President Carter came in at the end of the 70s. That was a period of idealism, but an idealism that was frustrated in many ways, such as the crisis in Tehran with the taking of the U.S. Embassy and so on, which led us to the Reagan years. Those were years that the church was living through and trying to respond to.
I find it ironic that American culture during the 1960s and 70s was seemingly going in one direction. Institutions, the old order, if you will, was being railed against. And here are the Lutherans, on the other hand, talking about unity and building institution and structure. It seemed like you were going against the grain a bit.
Well, we weren't the only ones. The Presbyterians did it also. The Methodists had done something of it even earlier. So they were already the United Methodist Church. So we weren't alone at all in the field of Protestantism.
Talk about the CNLC. What were some of the challenges that you faced during that process? It wasn't all a bed of roses.
Well, I think the first great debate was theological, and there were some differences of view, but the group came to a consensus, a relative consensus, on the statement that is now in the Constitution of the ELCA, which recognizes the richness of the meaning of the Word of God, first of all, in reference to the Lord Jesus Christ, and secondly, for the Bible, and that was a big step for some people. But there were relatively few on the commission itself that had trouble with making that step. So that was the first issue, I would say, to get beyond a fundamentalist, literalist understanding of the Holy Scriptures. A second debate was over the overall structural organization of the church. And this varied as time went on. There was a point at which a proposal was made that there be two regions. An eastern region, which would have been made up primarily of LCA people, a western region, which would have been made up primarily of ALC people. And that was the reason for the proposal, thinking that those two regions could feel very much at home with the past as well as try to work together for the future. That didn't take off at all. It didn't last very long. Then there was some division over whether the synods should be larger or smaller. The idea being that a small synod could be organized to give more attention to congregational life, the placement of pastors and the nourishment of pastoral ministry and so on. And that was an exceedingly heated debate. A part of the idea of smaller synods was to have regions that would be primarily responsible for the institutions of the church, the colleges, the social ministry agencies, and so on, but also a place where synods in a region could parley together about things of common concern. So what you had was a compromise, where there would be some larger synods and some smaller synods. And in every case, there would be regions. But also a part of that was a division of labor. The nationwide church would have part of the responsibility for colleges and seminaries and so on. the local synods would have some of the responsibility for those institutions, and they would have almost a whole responsibility for social ministry agencies. Now, that was a compromise, and you will see regions where the synods tend to be smaller and other regions where the synods tend to be larger. And again, it was partially a division between ALC favoring the smaller synods and the LCA favoring the larger synods. And then the debate, I took part in that debate favoring the smaller synods. I'd been a synod president of a large synod and knew not only how that tore me apart, but the feeling that I never quite did justice to the care of pastors and congregations. But the big fight was over the location of the national headquarters, where I proposed Chicago. Not New York, which was the LCA headquarters, and not Minneapolis, St. Paul, which was the ALC headquarters, but Chicago, which was between the two of them, and which had the best air service of any city in the country. That was actually voted by a majority. And then a couple of the leaders in the CNLC asked for a recount and gave reasons why there should be more careful study of this. And so it went for a study, and a group was employed that does that sort of thing. And that furthered the debate, and it looked as though Chicago might win. Then there was a diverting action that it be Milwaukee. And of course, the two Milwaukee representatives on the CNLC were overjoyed, and a lot of money was spent to convince us that Milwaukee was the right place. And then they hired another agency to make a survey and study, and finally the decision ended up with Chicago. But that was one of the biggest fights of the whole CNLC.
Very interesting. Some have used the word representational principles. Others have used the word quotas. How did that whole issue
Yes. Well, of course, that was a major issue in society in America at the time. Representation of minority groups, representation of women, youth, and it was bound to be reflected in the church. And I think it is correct to say that the majority of the members of CNLC were in favor of proper proportional representation for each of these groups. There were those who were opposed to it, thought it was not as democratic as it sounded, but it came out. We didn't call it quotas, of course, but it did call for promised, in fact, written into the bylaws, representation by minority groups and by women and by youth in all the decision-making units of the church.
But in trying to fashion, to structure an organization the size of the ELCA, what was to become the ELCA, a lot of decisions had to be made. And having these sort of this sort of tone of inclusivity does not lend itself to making decisions easily.
Well, part of the reason that the CNLC took the positions it did, there had already been inclusiveness in the membership of CNLC. So you had women in good numbers, and you had some minority people. It was already there, and the church had gone along the route that society was going at that time.
The name, where did the name come from?
As I recall, that was a suggestion of Dr. Anderson, the head of the publishing house in the ALC. And I considered it a very excellent suggestion because it continued the letters LCA, but it also continued the letters of a former church body of Norwegian background, the ELC. So it flew rather easily.
Now, Teachin told me he wanted the Evangelical Catholic Church in America. So
He would never have gotten a majority for that.
That's exactly what he said. Flew like a lead balloon. Did that which the CNLC crafted and envisioned come to fruition, or did something else emerge?
I think one of the great topics of divisive discussion was on ecumenical relations and the proposals for full communion. As it developed, there was greater opposition to full communion with the Episcopal Church than with the Presbyterian and Reformed Church. The opposition to full communion with the Presbyterian and Reformed Church actually focused on the inclusion of the United Church of Christ, UCC, because their doctrinal basis seemed so ephemeral, so hard to nail down. But the Presbyterians and Reformed insisted that UCC be included with any decision about full communion with them. And I think that got voted in part because the people who were primarily concerned with full communion with the Episcopal Church voted for Presbyterian Reformed UCC, a vote that was taken before the vote on the Episcopal Church. Those who really weren't so favorable toward the Presbyterian Reformed UCC voted for it anyway, thinking that if there was a majority for that, they'd get a majority for the Episcopalians. Actually, a two-thirds majority is what we're talking about. But it didn't succeed the first time around, and succeeded rather narrowly by comparison when the second vote was taken 2 years later.
So many members of the ELCA today are not from a Lutheran background. Or if they were, their memory of, after 15 years now, their memory of the LCA or the ALC has, or the AELC has somewhat, faded. Why should members of this church now pay attention to this story? Why the CNLC and the whole merger process? Why is it a significant matter?
I think the basic reason is that you want to remember your progenitors for the same reason that you consider history of importance at all. Why do we continue to take interest in the Revolutionary War and the formation of our country when so many radical changes have taken place since the Constitution was first written and since the Declaration of Independence was publicized? I think there are principles embodied in that history that prove to be valuable as future decisions are made.
Another matter I have to ask you about is the publishing house. What's the story there? I mean, why is there a publishing house up in, it seems like the whole church-wide organization is in Chicago. Why is there a publishing house in Minneapolis? And how did that story pan out?
Well, in the LCA, the publishing house was in Philadelphia, not in New York, where the central offices were located. And the fact that Albert Anderson, head of the ALC publishing house, continued to hold sway, whereas the LCA head was at retirement age, meant that Al Anderson became the chief executive of the whole operation. and Al operating in the center. Us thought it would be well to continue the Philadelphia operation and have it responsible for the things that it was doing best, such as the liturgical arts and Fortress Press, and let Minneapolis take those things which they were doing best, which were parish education materials and so on. But Al didn't see it that way, and his influence, I think, was the greatest in determining that it should all be moved to Minneapolis.
Talk about Columbus and the Constituting Convention when it became a reality. What were your thoughts on that day?
I have very few memories of it either. I remember mostly the worship service where the 4 candles were brought together, and to make one candle, that was a symbolic act that pretty well demonstrated what was happening in the organization. But other details, I wasn't responsible. I was a delegate to the convention, but otherwise I didn't have any particular responsibility. I was elected to the church council at that convention, but what that meant came later.
It must have been, for all those involved in leadership positions, a somewhat bittersweet experience. While on one hand you were greeting a new Lutheran church with all of that, the potential and all the promise, but on the other you were saying goodbye to quite a lot.
Yes, but I was no longer in the leadership of the LCA either. I had left the presidency 10 years before the CNLC began, and then was elected by the South Carolina Synod to be at the conventions of the LCA, but that was about the only contact I had with the church in that interim period.
So you grieve not for the LCA?
No, not particularly.
And is there anything you'd like to add about the whole process of the merger and perhaps its legacy and where we are today?
Again, I am so tenuously associated with the ELCA that I can't say that I have an inside view of things. I depend almost entirely on the Lutheran. People tell me I should have email and all of this claptrap, but I say I get all the mail I want and learn more than I know how to handle. So that's about my degree of contact.